ready to go. So what we're going to be doing today, I looked at the syllabus and I actually think we're going to be fine because we were going to start on, I think, Chapter 6 before exam number 2. So this is just going to reshuffle those. But looks like we are going to have time for to take the full look at perception. So today we're going to continue on with our sort of special look at special topics in perception. Today focusing on picture perception. But before we get to that, just a couple of announcements. Number one, the exams have been graded, and I will be passing those back for you to have a look at in an upcoming lecture. Was going to do it today, but I don't know if we'll have time today. But we will have time at the beginning of one of these classes. I'll hand them back. You'll have a chance to take a look at them before passing them back, so I can have them in my records. The second thing is we're going to have a very brief hiatus from the Innovations and Suggestions in Social Media Professional Development Program. So they will be coming back next week, but this week I just didn't have time to set up the next stage. And that's partly because, actually 3 announcements. The third one is that I'm going to be at a conference this weekend on Friday and Saturday. It's the MSU Comics Forum conference. So this is a conference where me and 3 other IUSP students are going to be presenting our comic book research, our research on this visual language of comics. So just for your own information, if you're interested to kind of see the sort of work that I do, our presentations are going to be Saturday at 10:30 a.m. And we're actually going to live stream that on YouTube. So if you're up at that time and you want to kind of take a look at some of the work that your fellow students are doing here, and the kind of work that I do in my lab, feel free to join us. It'll be on my YouTube channel, and our presentation again 10:30 on this Saturday. All right, so special topic today, picture perception. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this really interesting kind of challenge to any sort of theory of vision. So picture perception is something that we can all do. We can all look at pictures, we can all make sense of pictures, but it's a very weird thing that we do, and we'll see why that is. So if we can understand picture perception, that might be the sort of gateway into understanding all of perception. So that's one of the reasons why we're going to focus on it. So we'll take a look at why study picture perception, and then we'll spend most of today's class on what is a picture. And this is one of those times, we've always started this way. When we looked at attention, we started with what is attention. When we looked at cognition, we defined what is cognition, what is representation. When we started perception, we try to define what is perception. So we're going to continue that, and you're going to see that it's actually rather difficult to define exactly what a picture is. And that's going to be illustrated in the fact that there are 4 definitions that we are going to go through, and we're going to see that almost none of them can cover everything that we know we can do with pictures. So this is a callback to Marr's tri-level hypothesis. Level number 1, computational level. We know what we can do with pictures. We know how we interact with pictures. We know the information that we can get from pictures. Level 2, the representational level. What are the strategies that we do this? That we still don't have. That we don't have an adequate explanation yet, and you're going to see that there were 4 attempts to try to do that. And I love these attempts because you can see what I was talking about. There's Gibson 1954, and there's Gibson later when he changed his mind in 1971. And then we'll end with the final objection that nobody can cover, which is metaphoric images, which for some reason is the area that I decided to do my research in, trying to fit that kind of last piece. All right, so why study picture perception? So there's a few reasons for this. Number 1, just scientific curiosity. So it's a behavior that we can do. If we want to understand psychology, if we want our psychology to be complete, we have to explain picture perception. So just that alone, at least for me, is usually enough. I'm usually like, if it's out there and we don't know how to explain it, let's explain it. It's kind of like you see a mountain and you're like, it's there, that's why I'm going to climb it. So that's one reason. But what's a more sort of practical, pragmatic reason? One of the reasons to test, to take a look at picture perception and try to understand it, is that it is a great test of picture perception theories. And the idea is that our visual system was not made to do picture perception. Our visual system did not develop so that we could take a look at flat images, on a piece of paper and make sense of those particular images. So if you take a look at the development of our cognitive systems, we have basically us in our final form right around there. So we got a Homo sapiens coming out about 100,000 years ago. And we really haven't changed very much since that time, especially our kind of fundamental physiological characteristics. So our visual system, importantly, has not changed during that time. So that was 100,000 years ago. This was when our visual system was fully formed, right? It was done. We had it. It was good to go. The earliest cave paintings that they have records of, they might have beaten this recently. I think they found another, maybe earlier one. But around the earliest cave paintings that we have records of are about 32,000 years ago. So you can see that there was a large gap between when we had our final visual system and when we had pictures. And what that means is that our visual system was not made to perceive pictures. Our visual system was done before pictures were developed. And then that picture, that ability to perceive pictures just piggybacked on top of that existing visual system. So what that means is that if you have a theory that can explain the perception of the real world, if you have a theory that can explain how we perceive the environment that we're in, it needs to be able, if it's an accurate, true theory, it also needs to be able to explain picture perception. So picture perception did not develop out of a new mechanism. It did not develop out of a new kind of ability that we had. It piggybacked on top of our already existing visual system. So if you have a theory of perception that cannot account for picture perception, you have an incorrect theory, because you don't have a separate theory for picture perception, You have one theory and it's got to cover everything, because picture perception jumped onto that existing system. So that makes picture perception one of those great tests for any sort of visual theory. So we're going to see here Gibson try to apply his ecological theory to picture perception, failed once in 1954, came back in 1971, but that's the kind of idea that he was working with, this idea that if he has a visual perception theory, and it is correct, it should be able to explain pictures. And if it can't explain pictures, then it's not a correct visual theory, and it won't really be what's going on in the real world. So this is the kind of pragmatic reason to do it as a test of perception theories. All right, so now we know why we're studying picture perception. So what are we actually studying? What is a picture? And this is one of those kind of interesting phenomena that we encounter in psychology over and over and over again, where you know it when you see it, but it's really hard to define. So you know a picture when you see it. So, for example, right here, the children of Sunnydale School in Sunderland had these pictures here. So this is a picture right here. And does anybody know what they're looking at? What is this a picture of? This is a tiger. All right, so it's a picture of a tiger. And you were able to get whatever information this picture was giving you and come to the conclusion that, yes, it was a tiger. Some of you did not pick up on tigerness. I saw some faces that looked surprised when she said tiger. So let's try another one. What is this a picture of over here? That is people playing soccer. So there is enough information in this picture for you to decode that these are people and that's a soccer ball right there. So you probably need to go through a lot of top-down processing to get to that point. But again, they communicated that kind of information. Any idea what that is? Yeah, me neither. I have no idea what that is. But it's an example of what we're going to see later, a picture without what they call fidelity. So this one did not communicate what it was intended to, right? This one, the artist intended you to see a tiger, and yeah, you saw a tiger. This one, the artist intended you to see a soccer game. Yeah, you saw a soccer game. So these are both successful pictures. This one, the artist intended you to see something. We don't know what it is, but you didn't. So that's an instance where the communication just wasn't made. The picture was not actually perceived. So we have that idea of what a picture is, and we can see that pictures can be very different even when they're representing the same thing. So there is this idea of representation, right? This is representing a tiger. It's not a real tiger, it's a picture of a tiger, but it's representing that tiger. And here we have another picture representing the same thing. It's also representing a tiger. And here we have another picture representing a tiger. And one of the things that we research on in metaphoric, and some of the metaphoric research in my lab, is that when you see this image here, there's enough information here that you kind of fill in the rest, and you don't see a severed tiger head, you see a tiger. So if I put up this picture and said, what do you see? Most people would say, oh, I see a tiger, rather than, oh, I see a severed tiger head. Because there's information that this is supposed to represent, even though it's not there, supposed to represent the entire tiger. And then we got a highly stylized tiger over here, 4 different pictures of tigers, 4 very different ways of representing a tiger, and yet somehow all of them capture that representation of what a tiger is. All right, so let's continue on with this sort of illustration of what pictures can actually do. So here's a picture, it's a line drawing of a aircraft. Here's a painting of a bridge in Venice. So you can see that pictures can have very little information, so there's no shading, there's no texture, and yet we can still perceive that as that aircraft. And then they can be photorealistic. So this is a photo of a bridge in Venice, and tons of information that we are able to process. Other things that we can do with pictures, you can kind of play around with certain conventions. You can actually use the picture itself to communicate things that you might not be able to communicate in the real world. So Magritte is one of those painters that does a lot of this. So we have the Son of Man here, and this is one of those surrealist paintings that is more than just a person with an apple in front of their face. You know, it kind of represents this idea of mysteriousness. It kind of represents, like, do you even know who this person is? The apple in front of the face, you're probably super interested in who this person is because you can't quite see it. And then Rene Magritte also has this picture here called The Treachery of Images, which is just this classic illustration. It's in French here, and it goes, "This is not a pipe." And it kind of shows just how easily we process pictures. Because if I asked you, oh, what is this? Most of you would say, oh, it's a pipe. And he's reminding us that, no, that's the treachery of images. You almost see through the image to what it's representing. And he's reminding us that is not a pipe. This is a picture of a pipe. And to kind of paraphrase Scott McCloud, that's actually not even a picture of a pipe. It's a picture of a picture of a pipe. And it's not even a picture of a picture of a pipe. It's a projection of a picture of a pipe. And yet we still kind of just go to the representation and say, oh no, that's a pipe. So pictures are very powerful. We can easily communicate things in pictures. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start off with the first definition, and it's my definition, and I'll just warn you, it's a bad definition. So I put it up here for illustration purposes only. Do not really, pay too much attention to this, but this is one of those definitions that I'm going to use an example of, in terms of like critical thinking, something that you should always look for in a definition that should raise a red flag whenever you see it. Because if any definition falls into the same category as my definition, it's not a good definition. So what was my attempt? So back in 2016, when I started research in picture perception, what did I try to define a picture as? So I defined a picture is a non-propositional visual representation on a two-dimensional plane. So a picture is a non-propositional definition, so that's what it is. It's not words, it's not text, it's not propositions, and it's a visual representation, and it's on a two-dimensional plane. So as it stands here, that really seems to capture what a picture is, right? So if you saw a picture, it's not words, it's on a two-dimensional plane, it's visual, it represents something, so it seems to work so far. So this non-propositional definition would say that this is a picture. This image of Mona Lisa, that is a picture of Mona Lisa. It's non-propositional, but it's a representation on a 2D and it's visual. This, on the other hand, would not be a picture of Mona Lisa because this is propositional, right? And you can describe her: Caucasian female, long hair, hands folded on lap, mysterious smile, lit from the upper left, etc., etc., etc. And you could eventually get enough detail, right? That idea of a picture is worth 1,000 words. You could eventually get to enough detail where they would be like, oh yeah, that's the Mona Lisa, but that's not a picture of the Mona Lisa. So it's the idea of that non-propositional representation. So this is a non-propositional representation of what a pipe is. So this would also be a picture as well. So far, so good. We seem to be capturing the essence of what a picture is, but it actually was a horrible definition. And my supervisor, Dr. John Kennedy, kind of almost immediately pointed this out. So I remember the lab meeting, I came in there and I was like, oh, I got this great definition, like this is where we should start. And he was like, no, it's not. Because it's actually a very bad definition. And here's the reason why, and this is what you should look for in any definition of anything as you go forward. So it's a bad definition because it defines what a picture is by defining what it's not. And that's a negative definition. So it doesn't tell you what a picture actually is, it tells you what it isn't. It says, you know what, it's not a propositional representation. So that's kind of snuck in there. It seems to make sense because a picture isn't a propositional representation, but this definition doesn't actually tell you what a picture is. It tells you what a picture isn't. And if you come across a negative definition like that for anything, if you have to define something in terms of what it is not, that is your red flag to know that that definition doesn't capture what that thing is, and it's a bad definition, and you probably should not be using that definition. So it's not a propositional representation, bad definition. We need to try to define what a picture actually is rather than what it is not. So bye-bye non-propositional definition. And the reason why it's bad, the reason why these negative definitions are bad is because they lead to a circular definition. So if somebody said to you, well, what is a picture? And you're like, well, it's a non-propositional representation. And they're like, okay, great. What's non-propositional? And you're like, well, anything that's not linguistic, like pictures, music, sculptures, basically anything that's not linguistic, like pictures. And then they're like, well, what is a picture? Well, it's something that's non-propositional. That's great. What's non-propositional? Well, it's anything that's not linguistic, like a picture. Okay, what's a picture? Well, it's non-propositional, right? You can't get out of it. You're stuck in the loop, and you don't understand. There's nothing to be gained whatsoever from this definition. All right, so if I ever do crack it, I'm gonna be glad to be in the same category as Gibson, where they'll probably be like, you need to reach 2016, you need to reach 2020, and they'll know that I completely changed my mind. All right, speaking of Gibson, we're going to get to his next, but let's continue on with a little bit more of a look at pictures. So we're going to continue on a little bit more with that computational level of understanding a picture. Basically, what can a picture actually represent? So as it turns out, a picture can represent tons of things. So a picture can represent things that actually exist. So a picture can represent lions and sunsets, things that are actually out there in the real world. A picture can also represent things that don't exist, right? So unfortunately, unicorns, not real, mythical creatures. And yet you can still have a picture of these things that don't exist, a picture of these mythical creatures. So we can represent things that actually are in the real world. We can represent things that are not in the real world. We can do things like things that can be seen. So you can represent a basket of apples. And you can do things that cannot be seen. So you can represent things like emotions, right? We can't see emotions. You can represent love. You can represent romance. And if you want to take this to its logical conclusion, you can actually represent things that cannot be seen. You can represent invisibility in a picture. So if you've ever read the Fantastic Four, if you're familiar with the Invisible Woman, there have been many ways to draw the fact that she is invisible in comics. So this is just a way of truly representing something that can't be seen. You can actually represent the fact that she is invisible in these comic pages. So there's another version of her being invisible, and once again, literally representing something that cannot be seen. All right, other things that pictures can represent, very importantly for my early work in pictures, they can represent space. They can represent the spatial layout of the world, and they can represent space in a lot of different ways. So clearly, easily, we've all I think this is where most of us start with our picture drawing. They can represent two-dimensional space, right? So you can draw a square, it's got height, it's got width, we got two-dimensional space being represented. It can also represent one-dimensional space, right? So we can represent just a line, just width, no height, no depth, nothing else, just that one dimension. It's not actually one-dimensional because there is height to this line here, but it represents one dimension. You can actually represent 0 dimensions, right? Just a point. You don't have length, you don't have width, you don't have depth, you got a place in space. We can represent 0 dimensions with a picture. We can go into the 3rd dimension with a picture. So this is magical because it's two-dimensional. Your picture is two-dimensional, and yet you can represent a 3-dimensional image, and we can very easily perceive that that is a 3-dimensional cube. Let's keep this going. You can actually represent 4 dimensions. So you can take this cube, and the same way that we took a square and extended it into the 3rd dimension, you can take a cube and extend it into the 4th dimension. And what you end up with is a thing called a tesseract. So a tesseract is a 4-dimensional cube. So this is a picture of a 4-dimensional cube. And it's a little difficult to see it in this version, but just the same way that you could take a 3-dimensional object and put it in front of the light, and it'll cast a shadow onto a 2-dimensional plane. And as you turn that object, the shadow will change in that 2-dimensional plane. You can do that with 4 dimensions. So you can take a 4-dimensional object, you can put it in front of a light, shine light on it, project it into our 3-dimensional world. And if you do that with a tesseract, that's what it'll look like when you spin it. So that is zoom in on that a little bit. That's a kind of video representation of what a tesseract would actually look like. And videos fall into kind of like their own category, a little bit of an extension of a picture, but the same kind of principle of representing things in a visual, flat medium. Anybody else think of Wrinkle in Time when I was talking tesseract? Yeah? Kind of wish that movie did better. There's, I think there's like 5 or 6 books in the entire series, Anyways, that was my little rant for the day. Okay, so we can represent space. We can represent time as well. So this is an example of representing time in a picture. So whenever anybody sees this, nobody thinks of themselves, oh, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. What do you call 12 identical siblings? You know, what's the word for that? 12 uplets? No, nobody sees this and says, oh, that's 12 uplets. They perceive this as one girl picking up a ball, and this is across time. So she picks up the ball, she throws it, she's rather pleased with herself over here in terms of what happened. So it can represent time as well. You understand that these images happen one after another, and you can represent that in a picture. All right, so we need a better definition. So we're going to go to Gibson, and what we're going to see is that each of these definitions try to explain something about pictures, and then run into a roadblock, and then a new definition comes to try to overcome that roadblock. So we're going to go through the 3 major definitions that have been used. So we'll start off with Gibson. So I'll read the quote. It goes, "A faithful picture." So a faithful picture is, for our intents and purposes, it's one that looks like what it's representing. So if your picture is representing a tiger and it looks like a tiger, that's a faithful picture. If your picture is representing a tiger and you show it to somebody and they say, what is that? That's not a faithful picture. It's not the exact definition, but that's going to work for us. So a faithful picture was a delimited surface so processed that it yielded a sheaf of light rays to a given point, which is the same as would be the sheaf of rays from the original scene to a given point. That is, when the adjacent order of the point of color in the cross-section of one corresponding to the adjacent order in the cross-section of another. All right, there's a lot of words in there. It's a big definition. So a picture was a delimited surface. What that means is a surface that has edges, right? It's just a surface that has a beginning and an end. It doesn't extend into infinity. So processed means you painted on it. You treated it, that it yielded a sheaf of light rays. This is that ambient optic array. So your picture was so made that it yielded an ambient optic array to a given point, which is the same as would be that ambient optic array from the original real world scene. So for this definition here, basically what Gibson is saying is that a picture is something that reproduces that ambient optic array that you would have seen if you looked at the real thing. So this is the core of this. It's called the point-by-point projection theory. The core of this is perspective. It's that idea of perspective geometry. Remember, we talked about the ambient optic array, the perspective structure that underlies the invariant structure. Well, in this case, Gibson's going back to perspective, back to that geometry, to explain what a picture actually is. So let's take a look at that a little bit in more detail. So we have perspective and pictures and perspective geometry. So perspective geometry is important to a vision researcher, to vision theories, because it is the starting point for the information that's entering your visual system. So the light that enters your eye here and gets projected onto the back of your retina, the fact that it starts off from different points but converges to a single point and then expands back out to a projection, the fact that that is how your eye is made means that the structure of this light, the angles at which it comes in, they're determined by perspective geometry. So perspective geometry is the beginning of how we perceive the world. So this system was developed by Brunelleschi back in the Renaissance. So he is the one that discovered perspective, or at least discovered the underlying math. And that's why all of a sudden in the Renaissance, painting started to become very realistic, very convincing, and depth was everywhere. Tiles are one of the easiest things to draw in perspective, and it's no coincidence that tiles were everywhere in perspective pictures when they first started coming out in the Renaissance. So how is this actually made? How would you actually make a perspective picture? Well, this is a nice little diagram. of what you actually do. So if this is the real world over here, and this is the artist over here, you can think of this paint, this canvas, think of it as a window that the light from the box is passing through the window to the artist's eye. If you just make a point everywhere that this light intersects that window, you will draw that box and you'll draw it in perspective. So if this artist stood there, didn't move their eye, and just took a magic marker and traced out the box on the window, what was on the window would be a perspective picture of the box. And you can see that the cone that's coming from the actual box produces the same cone as from the actual picture, and that's the idea of producing that same ambient optic array. So let's take another look at that. So this is a little mock-up that I made. So if you have the world and you have a tree, and you have an observer down here, and you have a picture surface, the way that you draw a perspective picture is you take a point from the tree and you figure out if a straight ray of light went from that point to where the observer is, where does it intersect your picture plane? So it would intersect the picture plane right there. So you would put a little dab of green right there. And then you choose another point on the tree, find out where that intersects the picture, put a little dab of green there, take another point on the tree, find out where that intersects the picture plane, put a little dab of brown in this case, and then eventually with enough dabs, you will have a perspective picture of that tree. And if you did it correctly, then that depicted tree, that picture, will produce the same cone of light. So this cone of light over here, whatever its angles are coming to the observer, a perspective picture makes the same cone, right? So it produces that same structure, produces that same cone of light, and that's the procedure for getting that cone correct. All right, so that's the point-by-point projection theory. And going back to Magritte, he kind of played around with this idea of the point-by-point projection theory. So he used to draw, because he was just that kind of guy, he would draw pictures inside of pictures. And all of these sort of pictures that we're going to see with Rene Magritte, they play with that idea of that point-by-point projection. So if you were to remove this picture right here, this painting, the scene would not change. The only thing that would change is there should be a wall right there. But these waves, you can see, just go exactly into these waves. So that's what the outside world would actually look like in this picture inside a picture. So this is another example of it. So you can see that a perspective picture almost disappears into the scene because the light from the picture lines up exactly with the light from the real world. So here's another example. Magritte really loved this kind of an idea. And you can also kind of see this. These were big, kind of like a few years ago, where people would try to match up kind of in a point-by-point projection way, things that they drew with the real world. So here we have, matching up the point-by-point projection of this individual. So if you took this away, this is pretty photorealistic. This is what the person would look like. And you can see that it matches up with the with the bag, with the background. I'm pretty sure Tinkerbell's not there. But, and you can, and other people were just kind of playing around with this. So this idea of matching up point-by-point projection, sometimes late for fun. But you can see that idea of lining up what's in your picture with what might be out there in the real world, not always, but that idea of that sort of lining it up with the real world, that was the essence of Gibson's 1954 theory. And you can see here, sometimes you can actually kind of, I think maybe, no, it's not the right one. I thought they found the original. Nope. But that's the idea of the point-by-point projection theory. All right, so the point-by-point projection theory, so far so good. We know what perspective pictures are. We know how to do perspective pictures. Seems like a pretty good definition so far. But there were objections. There were objections to this point-by-point projection theory, and they were they were great objections. So the point-by-point projection theory is too limited. And the reason it's too limited is that it can only explain perspective pictures. So any other picture will fall outside of that point-by-point projection theory, so it cannot explain line drawings. The point-by-point projection theory cannot explain how it is that we can perceive that as an airplane, as an aircraft. Because this line drawing, it's missing all the points. It's missing 99% of the points, right? There's no brightness. There's no cone that is capturing the brightness. There's no cone that's capturing color. There's no cone that's capturing any texture. There's basically very little of the cone that was in the real world being preserved by this line drawing. So if you need that point-to-point correspondence between your drawing and the outside world, we shouldn't be able to see that. This should be the same as that drawing from that elementary school. People should show you this and say, hey, what do you think of this drawing? And you should be like, I have no idea what that is, if the point-by-point correspondence theory is true. The fact that we can see it means that we need a new theory. Other objections, we've seen these before, caricatures, right? In this caricature here of President Obama, there's no point-by-point correspondence. In fact, a caricature is successful when you break that point-by-point correspondence, when you destroy that perspective structure. So the fact that we can still see identify Obama here means that that point-by-point structure is not required. That point-by-point correspondence is not really what a picture is. All right, so any questions on the point-by-point theory before we go to the better definition, maybe? All right, better definition by Goodman in 1968. So Goodman gave this definition, I'll quote it again. Representations, then, are pictures that function in somewhat the same way as descriptions. Just as objects are classified by means of or under various verbal labels, so also are objects classified by or under various picture labels. So this was a kind of linguistic approach to pictures. So what Goodman is saying is that just the same way that we've developed language and the correspondence between what we say and what we're representing is arbitrary. So the fact that I call this book, and you know what I mean when I say book, there's nothing about this that needed to be called book. And you can see this when you take a look at different languages, right? So if you say, when we say the word dog, we know that that refers to a particular animal. But there's nothing about the word dog that was required to refer to that animal. And you know this if you study Spanish, you know it's perro. If you study French, you know it's chien. It's called different things in different languages. There's no reason it had to be dog. Well, the same way that we just decided that these symbols, dog, book, cat, they're going to refer to these real things in the world. Goodman is arguing that that's how we develop pictures. We just said, here are all these visual elements, and just the same way that you learn an auditory language, we learn a visual language. And that visual language allows us to perceive pictures. So this is the symbol theory of pictorial information, and its idea is that, much like language, pictures are composed of symbols. So we read these symbols very quickly. That's why we kind of don't notice that the symbols are there. But pictures are composed of symbols, just like a language is composed of symbols. So let's take an example of how this might explain picture perception. So we'll go back to the School of Athens here. And according to Goodman, if I was to ask you to decode this picture and basically try to decode the spatial arrangement of different individuals, you might have to determine who's further away from you and who's closer to you, right? Which person is further away, which person is closer. And you would see that this person here takes approximately that much of your visual area. That person over there takes up much less. So these two ovals are exactly the same. And because you've learned how to read a picture, according to Goodman, because you've learned this language, you know that smaller and higher up from the bottom of a picture, right, higher in the picture plane, you know that in our language that means further away. That means that this individual is further away. And smaller than this means that they're the same size, right? So you can decode a lot of what this picture is if you understand the language of what the picture is trying to communicate. And if you see pictures that are trying to communicate certain metaphors, you know, so the persistence of memory, the idea of like a melting memory, that we're losing things, that they're just kind of, you know, going away over time, that can be represented. And if you take a look at a picture like this and go, oh, I get it, that means that you have learned the language and you can understand the picture. If you take a look at a picture like this and you go, huh, what is that? That means that you don't know the language. So that's another kind of way to understand why some pictures people perceive and some other pictures people don't. So you can communicate things like, you know, death with the skull. This is called all is vanity, implying that, you know, being vain is just not a good pursuit in life. And again, you know, we're using the symbol here of the skull to indicate death, to bring about that idea of, you know, not something you would want to pursue. And then one of the kind of key things that this theory can explain is, again, why we struggle with some forms of art and why we're very easily understanding other forms of art. So if you ever take a look at an abstract painting, if you ever take a look at something that's cubist, like Guernica by Pablo Picasso, and you look at it again and you're like, what is that? I don't get it. That just means that you don't speak the language. So according to Goodman, it means that you don't speak cubist. That's not a language that you learn. Just the same way that you might not speak French, you know, in terms of auditory language, you don't speak cubist in terms of visual language. If you did, the same way that when you looked at the School of Athens, and it immediately was apparent to you that these were people standing around, some people further away, some people closer, it was a structure. The way you were able to decode that Renaissance painting almost immediately, Goodman argues that if you were raised and learned the language of Cubism, the language of abstract art, you could immediately take a look at this picture and say, oh, that's a representation of the bombing of Guernica in the Spanish Civil War. You would take a look at it, and at the very least, you would be like, oh, that looks like a bombing. That probably looks like a war. I'm not familiar with the history of that area, but it's probably people being attacked. And that's the argument that if you spoke this language, you would be able to decode it, you would be able to perceive that image. Any questions on pictures as symbols, pictures as language? All right, so you're going to get used to the pattern. Objections. What are the objections to Goodman's definition? Well, the big objection to Goodman's definition was the weakness of Gibson's previous definition, and that's perspective. So Gibson based his entire theory, his first theory, on perspective, and Goodman threw out perspective completely, and that's the major weakness, major objection to Goodman's theory, because perspective, it looks like, and there's evidence for this, it's not a convention. It's not arbitrary. It's not just something that we chose to do and something that is easy to step away from and learn a different way. Perspective seems to be something that is basically how our visual system is made. It's like a special language. So some say that perspective is not a convention. So Gibson came back and said, you know what? You know, maybe there are some sort of visual language aspects, but there has to be a fundamental grounding in perspective. So he said that it does not seem reasonable to assert that the use of perspective in paintings is merely a convention to be used or discarded by the painter as he chooses. When the artist transcribes what he sees upon a two-dimensional surface, he uses perspective geometry of necessity. So the idea is that you can't get away from perspective. You can try to break it for artistic effect, but it's what determines what works in a picture. So just to kind of contrast this with language, in our world of languages, right, there's no one language that is better than other languages. nobody can say that, well, you know, English as a language is more functional, it's better than French. And French as a language is better than Spanish. And Spanish as a language is better than Russian. They're different, but there's no one language that is better. Gibson is arguing that in visual language, perspective is better. Perspective is the language. It's like the fundamental language. It's almost like, the closest analogy we could have is like Latin. It's like the Latin of visual languages. It's what everything has to be based on. So he said perspective is not a convention. It's not an option. It's what we're fundamentally basing things on. Goodman came back. You can see that we're going back and forth. Goodman came back and said, no. It is a convention. So he goes in, I like this one, in diametric contradiction to what Gibson says. It's a very fancy way of saying you're completely wrong. But in diametric contradiction to what Gibson says, the artist who wants to produce a spatial representation that the present day Western eye will accept as faithful, that people speaking the current language will accept as faithful, must defy the laws of geometry and not use perspective. And this was actually what my PhD thesis was based on. As it turns out, he's right. We actually don't use exact perspective. We use an approximation to perspective. We use a very quick and dirty kind of rule to kind of process perspective. But that's for another day. So if perspective is a convention, if perspective is just one of many languages that will work visually, then there has to be other conventions. There have got to be other languages. We have been making pictures for long enough that we should have come up with different languages. So one of these languages that Kepi's proposed was that Chinese and Japanese painters, they don't use linear perspective. They don't use perspective the way that we use perspective. They use perspective differently. They speak a different perspective language. So they assign to linear perspective a diametrically opposite role from that given to it by Western painters. In their system, parallel lines converge as they approach the spectator. In their system, parallel lines, converge as they approach the spectator. They open up the space instead of closing it. So in Japanese art, and I just love this painting, so I had to put it up. In Japanese art, what they're saying is that if you were looking at train tracks, instead of the train tracks coming together as they go off into the distance, Japanese and Eastern painters have decided we're going to speak the language where the train tracks diverge as they go off into the distance. So Western cultures, converge means going off into the distance. Eastern cultures, diverge means going off into the distance. And that is known as inverse perspective. So we got a nice example of inverse perspective here. So this is a picture that was drawn in the 14th century. And as you can see, there's a lot of structures here that are representing parallel edges in the real world. And if you extend those edges, you can see that as they go off into the distance, they diverge. They're not converging. So we got those edges there, these edges over here, they diverge. These edges over here, they diverge. So this is an example of inverse perspective, and it is another convention. It's another way of speaking that visual language. All right, so is there a key difference between these two languages, right? Is there a key difference between regular linear perspective and inverse perspective? If there isn't, if both languages are the same, then regular linear perspective is just a convention, right? Just like all of our other auditory languages. If, on the other hand, inverse perspective cannot do all the things that linear perspective can do, then it's not as good as a language, and linear perspective has that status as being, the better non-convention decision. So linear perspective, actually there is a key difference. Linear perspective is systematic, inverse perspective is not. And what that systematic means, it basically means that there is nothing that exists in the real world that cannot be drawn by linear perspective, but there are tons of situations in the real world that cannot be drawn with inverse perspective. So it's as if you had two spoken languages, one that could describe our university here at IU South Bend, and one that just didn't have the words or the concepts to describe university, to describe students, to describe Indiana, you would have to say that that second language is just not as good as the first one. And that's what this is arguing. The linear perspective is better because everything can be drawn in linear perspective, not everything can be drawn in inverse perspective. So let's take a look at an example of this. So this is inverse perspective right here. And we can see that it's inverse because once again we have diverging lines as they go off into the distance. And what we can see here is that there's a bunch of stuff that starts to go wrong in this picture. So for example, these little footstools here, they make absolutely no sense because they're on the ground over here, but then they're elevated for some reason over here. You can see the leg here, you shouldn't be able to see that. And then importantly, not only are there those issues, but over here, this chair, if it was drawn in inverse perspective, would occupy the same space as the table drawn in inverse perspective. The two of them would be in exactly the same sort of space in this visual system. And that is why a talented artist will put this angel right there to kind of obscure that part. So every part here that would fail is either being obscured or just somehow dealt with. And that is one of the weaknesses of inverse perspective. You just cannot draw everything systematically. You can't represent everything that's in the real world. So inverse perspective fails as soon as we got two people sitting on the edge. Linear perspective, you can have Jesus and all the 12 apostles all sitting on one side of the table. But anyways, you can represent that image. There's no overlap. There's no contradictions. There's no violations. Linear perspective can represent all of the things in the world. And that indicates that it's special. It's probably not a convention. There's probably something fundamentally underlying our use of perspective. All right, any questions on Goodman's theory? All right. Last one, the better definition. So Gibson came back in 1971. Said Gibson 1954, no good, what am I going to do? So he said a picture is a surface so treated that a delimited optic array, so once again we have a picture, it's a surface, so treated, it's painted, that a delimited optic array, a chunk of the optic array, to a point of observation is made available that contains not the same information, but the same kind of information that is found in the ambient optic array of the ordinary environment. So he dropped the point-by-point correspondence, and rather than saying you have to produce 100% of that ambient optic array, 100% of that cone, what he's saying in this definition is that you need to represent the required parts of it. So it can be just a part of it, but you need to represent the information, a part of the information that's coming from the ambient optic array. So this is the pictures as information definition, and this is the idea that we process this optical information that your visual system just picks up. So again, we have that direct type of perception from that ecological perception that we were looking at. And this actually specifies properties of the world. So my favorite example of this comes from my favorite comedian, which is Mitch Hedberg. So if you've never seen him, unfortunately, he's no longer with us. But he used to play around with language a lot. So he would say things like, P.S., this is what part of the alphabet would look like if Q and R were eliminated. And that's how he talked. I once saw a forklift lift a crate of forks, and it was way too literal for me. I don't have a girlfriend. I just know a girl who would get really mad if she heard me say that. Right? So the one I want to focus on is this one. He goes, Swiss cheese is my favorite kind because it's the only cheese you can draw with a pencil and a paper. Hey, do you have Swiss cheese in your sandwich? Sometimes. Because when you bite it, sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. All right, anyways. Importantly, only cheese you can draw with a pencil and a paper. That's the idea of pictures as information. Because if I showed you this, there's not enough information there for you to know what it is, right? So this could be a slice of cheese, right? This could be a piece of cake. This could be one of the little triangles from Trivial Pursuit, right? This could be a lot of things. Doesn't have enough information, right? Doesn't have enough to let you know. This is Swiss cheese, right? And we know it's Swiss cheese. We can see that it's Swiss cheese. It's not yellow. It's missing that. It doesn't have that kind of point-to-point correspondence. But the information that it gives you is enough information that you know that you're looking at Swiss cheese. And that's the idea of the pictures as information theory. You're not getting the whole optic array, but the part that you are getting is the invariant part, the part that does not change every single time you look at Swiss cheese. So it reproduces that invariant information. So pictures as information explains line drawings. We can see a line drawing because it reproduces that invariant information that would come from an aircraft. Photographs are still completely fine in this definition as well, because a photograph will reproduce almost all of the ambient optic array. So of course it reproduces the part that is required, because it's a subsection of the rest of it. Caricatures are back in, because once again they are effective not because they reproduce the perspective structure, but they reproduce the invariant structure. So as long as your picture reproduces that invariant structure of what the optic array was providing, then that is a successful picture. That is what a picture is all about. So one more time, objections to Gibson's pictures as information definition. And this is the reason why, one of the reasons why I went into metaphorical pictures. So the final definition in the objection is metaphorical pictures. And this is an objection because metaphorical pictures, we understand them, we can perceive them, but they don't actually represent anything in the real world. So you cannot reproduce the ambient optic array or the portion of the ambient optic array coming from something that never existed in the real world, that just doesn't have an optic array in the real world for you to reproduce. So it cannot contain the same kind of information that is found in the ordinary environment, because metaphorical pictures are depicting things that were never in the ordinary environment. So when I was giving you examples before for what is a picture, I actually snuck in a metaphorical picture. So this is a metaphorical picture. And none of you, when you saw this, interpreted it literally. So none of you, when you saw this, thought to yourself, oh my gosh, giant ghost lions. Where is this? I don't want to go to this horrible place that has giant ghost lions. None of you thought giant ghost lions. But all of you probably got the metaphorical communication, metaphorical information in this picture. You probably thought to yourself, okay, I get it. Lions, they're king of the jungle. They're very powerful. This is their domain. They rule over it. I get that. But ghost lions never occur in the real world. So how is it that you can understand that they're not ghost lions, they're actual lions? Gibson's definition just can't handle that aspect of it. Interestingly, this picture here of unicorns that don't exist, this is not a metaphorical picture. So this one is metaphoric. This one's actually not metaphoric, because if unicorns did exist, this would be a literal picture of what they are. This would be a literal representation of the way they exist. Another way to think of that is that if you put a horn on a horse, this is a literal picture of what that would be like. This does not occur in the real world whatsoever. So that's the final objection. So Gibson's 1954 point-by-point correspondence failed for caricatures, failed for line drawings. Goodman's theory of picture perception as a language failed because perspective seems to have that very special status. And now Gibson's final theory of perspective as pictorial information failed because it cannot account for metaphorical pictures, and that's something that we can do, so we need a definition that allows us to explain that. All right, any final questions before we do one last thing before we wrap up today? Any final questions on Gibson's Last theory? All right. So the last thing we're going to do is we're just going to mention next class, we're going to cover metaphorical pictures, and we're going to take a look at some research that I did with a former student here at IUSB, analysis of motions in comic book cover art using pictorial metaphors. This is an article that is available free online. I put the link in Canvas, so you can go to the modules and you can just click directly there to access it online. I would recommend, it's not required. We're going to really kind of ease into this because it is a journal article, not a textbook, so it's not written necessarily for like educational purposes. But I would say click on it, try to read through it, give it a shot. The more you kind of expose yourself to it first, the more it's going to make sense in class. But I am going to kind of start it at you have not read this sort of thing. But the link is there. Check it out, give it a look, and that's what we're going to be covering next class. So unless there's any questions, that's it for today. So I will see you all next class.